Okay, welcome to our second English Literature Revision lecture. We are going to cover all the elements of the exam tomorrow, starting with power and conflict poetry. So the whole point of my one is today going over the fact you can't revise all 15 of the poems. Okay, that's not feasible to do, particularly the night before your exam. But also going over the key things to remember when it comes to this exam and the ways you're going to be writing this essay. So I've just put a reminder up of the assessment objectives you're marked on here. So in the power and conflict, so the anthology poems, you're marked on AO1, AO2 and AO3. So answering the question and making comparisons, worth 12 marks. Talk about writer's methods, worth another 12 marks. And then bring in the context of the poem. So why these poems have been written and why they kind of exist in this anthology, why they come under power and conflict. Okay, so when we're thinking about what we do know about all the poems, one thing I did the other day with some students is we went through all 15 and we just kind of made ourselves familiar with the meaning of that poem and the context of that poem. Because obviously you get given one, there's one that's put in front of you, and then that means you know that, you know the message, you know the context, and you can deal with picking the techniques out of that poem in front of you. So I've given an example here, so I chose London, one I think quite a few people forget what it is about as a poem. So London is explicitly about the speaker walking through the streets of London, however implicitly it is exploring man's destruction of nature and corruption. Okay, so that's the meaning of the poem. And then the key context, remember, well, contextually Blake was a romantic poet and rejected industrialisation and the corruption in society as well as the destruction of nature. Okay, so two key things to remember there. So it's just knowing from all 15 that you know what the message is and you know the context, and that will do you well because then whichever one is in front of you tomorrow, you'll know its message, you'll know its story. Okay, I will be coming back to London, so don't worry if you haven't got that written down. So the one thing that you should have a copy of at home and we refer to in lessons is the comparison grid. So this is where I've decided the 6 key poems that you should revise before tomorrow. So the ones that have the most comparisons. So we went across the grid and kind of counted out which have the most crosses in the most sections. So it's broken down by power, conflict, personal experience and emotions. And so the ones we decided on then were Ozymandias, London, Exposure, Remains, Bayonet Charge and Kamikaze. Okay, there's 6 key ones that have kind of a larger way to access all the other poems. So they cover war, they cover conflict and other senses, and they cover power in a variety of ways, whether it's man or nature. But also a quick reminder, so this is where Miles works really well, so remembering to use that for your essay structures, so meaning being an introduction, and more of a checklist to have imagery analysed in there, to have language and structure, and always bring it back to the effect on kind of here how a reader reacts to these poems, what do they think of it, and how do they take the message away. Okay, so these are the 6 poems that I'm going to focus on. So the first poem then, oh no, not the first poem yet, I've skipped a bit. Just a reminder of the question structure, it's almost exactly the same every time. So they say how is, and they say a theme or an idea presented within your named poems, whichever one they've decided, and one other poem. So it's almost exactly the same. And really, if we think about the poems we've got, there's only so many themes that could be put in here, and it's always going to be a theme relevant to that named poem. So then our first poem, Ozymandias. So one we're all very familiar with, it was the first one we taught you in Year 10. So you should all know it quite well anyway. It's one of our shortest poems. So written by Percy Shelley. So in terms of the meaning, it's about kind of a statue that's broken and falling apart in the desert. There's nobody there to care anymore, and it's kind of covering a message about the power of man and the idea that only nature lasts. So we've got this man versus nature aspect to the message of the poem. The relevant context is he was a romantic poet as well. It's important to remember we've got quite a few romantic poets within this cluster of poetry. So one thing tonight you can look at, kind of familiarise yourself with, well, what do the romantics look in? If you just Google it, it'll come up for summary, just so you have a bit more understanding of what that means about their approach to poems. He was quite anti-authority and establishment. He had quite radical views for his time about the way to govern. And then also just to remember that, so Ozymandias, the statue, is based on a real pharaoh from ancient Egypt called Ramesses II. So key things there to bring into your kind of writing and your understanding of this poem. When we're looking then, so I broke it down by form, structure and language. So the form of the poem, it's a sonnet with kind of an irregular rhyme scheme happening. Traditionally a sonnet is a love poem. In this case, it kind of subverts that and goes against it. With the structure, we kind of get this speech marks to show this other speaker, this other narrative that comes across. There are 3 speakers in this poem. So we get the man who's met the traveller, we get the traveller, and we get the statue itself with its inscription. So those 3 voices of this poem. We get some caesura used to kind of create some focus, particularly around where it's saying ye mighty, the idea of that pride of Ozymandias, that authority that he's got there. And then going into language, so some key quotes here. So the King of Kings, it's got this kind of hyperbole to it, that sense that he thinks he is bigger than anyone. He had the most power, and then it's the irony actually that his statue's been destroyed over time from nature and it's kind of dissipated. We get words like antique, vast and trunkless, so those adjectives there, quite important to the poem. And then kind of this nothing besides remains, this 3-word sentence, this kind of statement, this last point that what is gone, everything that has kind of disappeared. The next one then, London, which I've already talked about briefly. So we know the meaning. We've got a speaker walking through the streets of London, exploring the idea that man's destroying nature and kind of also man is becoming corrupt over time. The context then is coming from a series of poems called Songs of Innocence and Experience. Quite often the poems are written with kind of a counterpart, whereas London doesn't. So it kind of comes under Songs of Experience, and the idea there's no innocence here. He thinks it's been lost over time. He's criticising kind of the society at the time. Remember, this is kind of Industrial Revolution. He's seeing society as corrupt. Again, a romantic poet, and he would have seen this destruction of nature. He would have had that hatred there. The structure, we've got these 4 quatrains. They replicate the kind of walking of the speaker through London, that movement, that regularity there. It has quite a lyrical rhyme scheme, the idea they're called songs of experience, so it has that sense to it. The main thing of the language, we get this kind of repetition of chartered, or chartered meaning organised, the streets have been planned out. We've got the anaphora of in every, trying to emphasise how much this is covering all man, all people. And we get the juxtaposition of the blackening church and light and dark, which shows the corruption, shows the things that he's identifying and seeing as wrong in society around him. Okay, so our 3rd poem. I know these are quick, but the lecture size will be uploaded and we'll have the copies of this if you don't manage to make the notes in time. So exposure then. So the meaning of exposure, and I realise I've not finished my sentence here for context. Oversight, very tired at the end of term. So it explores the direct experience of soldiers in combat and the threat from not only fighting but also the threat from nature. What I was trying to say here was he was a soldier in World War I. Okay, so that context is really important to understand the poem. It's quite a simple bit of context, remember, but the fact he was there, he was in the trenches and he died in the trenches. So this fact he's talked about this painful, long experience and actually, yeah, that he saw his fate kind of tied there. We get these 8 stanzas of 5 lines. We get lots of caesura kind of sitting through it, breaks up the idea like the fighting is coming in distant parts, it's broken up. And there's a half rhyme kind of integrated with an A, B, B, A scheme that's kind of unsettling to the reader. It's not meant to be happy, he wants us kind of pause and waiting. In terms of key bits of language, so he uses the kind of poignant misery of dawn, kind of the contrasting of sadness with new hope, like dawn is hopeful, but actually there's misery here. The kind of anaphora of but nothing happens, that repetition, that phrase coming up repeatedly. And then that final metaphor, a ghost drag home, those references to death, the idea that is drawn out, this pain, this suffering for him as an individual soldier, but he also makes it universal by using our and we throughout the poem. So those kind of collective pronouns that are used. The next one then, bayonet charge. The one that was given in the exam last year, so we'd hope that it probably won't be the given this time. So we see a nameless soldier become more of a weapon than a man, and we see nature and man greatly impacted by war. So the idea of that desensitising nature of being a soldier and being in that active combat. Ted Hughes himself was an RAF pilot, but he never actually saw real combat himself. He writes about kind of the elements and aspects of the natural world in much of his poetry. And it does seem that his poem is based on his father's kind of experience of the First World War, and as well as kind of by poems such as Wilfred Owen. So exposure, he's inspired by these poets that come before him. It's written in blank verse. We've got 3 stanzas in it, and we get this as Joran and Jonman kind of breaking up the poem. So kind of creating this urgency, this fear. He's running towards something, and he almost stops, but he continues. That's his desensitisation. He's becoming a weapon. A key quote then, the patriotic tear, the juxtaposition, the idea of he's like mocking the idea that we do this for our country, but actually, is it worth it? The alliteration of cold clockwork, the fact that people aren't feeling any emotions towards it. And then the kind of list he uses in there, that king, honour, human dignity, etc. Idea, that's meant to be the reasons they are there, but he kind of loses faith in that. The next one, Remains. So, very similar to Bayonet Charge, written by Simon Armitage, so a bit more modern. It's about a soldier who's conflicted between the loyalty he has for his comrades, but also the feeling of guilt for killing a potentially unarmed man. So we get that probably, possibly he's using throughout that to show that uncertainty. The context is actually this poem came out of a series of interviews that Armitage did as part of the documentary, and it's this soldier's actual story of him suffering from PTSD of killing this potentially innocent man. Again in blank verse, it's got 8 stanzas, it's got very kind of conversational, colloquial language. So the possibly armed, possibly not. The looter, so trying to not name the person they end up killing, being quite dehumanising with that language. And the metaphor of the blood shadow, so that stain left on the street, which represents the kind of memory that still haunts him. He's stuck with that message. And then our last one then, for the 6 I'm saying to focus on, is Kamikaze. Okay, so that internal conflict of a fighter pilot who's decided to not commit suicide as was expected, which is very interlinked with our context here. We know it's a suicide fighter plane. The idea that he should have done this for the pride and honour that would have been seen in him. And so it's about the differing opinions. We as a modern audience see the honour in him turning back, his family didn't. So those differing views there. It's a narrative poem, so it's telling a story. The poem changed to italics in the final stanzas to show there's a new voice in the poem. So you can see that, you can see it on the page, that change where it goes from kind of talking about one section to the next and seeing that difference. There's 7 stanzas, quite a regular structure. We get a metaphor of a head full of powerful incantations, to all the things that kind of were going through his head at that point, the questions he was feeling, deciding to turn back. The simile as though he no longer existed, that rejection from his family, what he went through, the effect that had on him. And the open question that he leaves us with at the end, which would have been the better way to die. So kind of questioning actually, would it have been worth the pride to kill himself in that moment? Or should he have stayed with what he did do and get rejected from his family? Okay, so that's everything for power and conflict. On the side, I've also included the same thing for all the other poems as well.
I'm Mrs. Daniel. I'm going to be looking through Unseen Poetry Review for tomorrow. It's the last section of your Literature Paper 2 exam. Despite it being the last section, I just want you to be really aware that it is a huge part of the exam. A lot of students in the past have left it right until the last minute of the exam and therefore missed out on some huge marks. So there's 2 questions within section C. The first question is worth 24 marks, which is massive, and then the second is worth 8 marks, and in the total you've got 32 marks. So just make sure that you really do pay attention to this part of the exam. You could even possibly think about what order you want to approach the exam. I'm not going to give you any specific advice. You need to do what's going to work best for you. But if you think approaching this one first might get you into the mood of the exam writing, then go for it. Okay, let's have a look at the first question. So this is the question I always get from a lot of my students that I teach. How much should I write? Well, there isn't really a correct answer for that question. You're looking probably for a minimum of about 4 paragraphs. You pretty much need to write the same for this one as you would do for the power and conflict section. Basically what you're going to be marked on is AO1 and AO2. Obviously assessment objective 3 is contextual details, and you won't know any contextual details for the poem that you get. It'd be very, very unlikely that a poem that you know would feature in this part of your exam. So don't try and talk about any of those outside information if you are familiar with the poet, although, like I said, it would be really unlikely that you would be. So consider the amount of marks that you're going to receive for this section. Consider how much time you have left. Consider what your examiner needs to see. So we're looking for AO1, we're looking for those quotations, and we're looking for AO2, so we're looking for your analysis. We're looking for you to use terminology, and we're looking for you to talk about the effect on the reader. Okay, and then, like I said, there's question 2 within section C. This one's slightly different. It's worth 8 marks. You're only being marked on AO2, so you're only being marked on your techniques, you're only being marked on your effect on the reader. However, saying that, you still will need to be referring to quotations, but just really consider which quotations you're going to pick would be my advice there, because you don't want to spend a really long time talking about the meaning of the poem and referring to quotations. So consider how many marks you get for this question. So it's only worth the 8 marks, so it's probably going to be quite considerably shorter than the previous answer that you would have written. Consider how much time you should give this question. This will be much shorter than the previous one, and annotate at least 3 techniques for both poems. So you're going to be talking about the second poem and the first poem for this one. So I think that each paragraph, really, you need to make sure that you're including a technique for both of the poems. Okay, so we're going to have a quick look at the mark scheme, because there's nothing really that I can show you other than the mark scheme and other than examples of questions. So we're going to have a quick look through this one. So up on the board I've got level 4. So to receive 13 to 16 marks, you need a clearly explained response to task and text. So what that basically means is answering the question and using quotations. For AO2, it's about writers' methods and appropriate use of subject terminology. Again, so that's using those techniques that you've been learning about for the last 3 years, and understanding the effects on the writer's methods. So you can't even get to a level 4 unless you're doing those things. So it's really important that you're, in every paragraph, you're considering what quote you've used and what technique is in each quote. For level 5, it gets a little bit more, you need to include a little bit more information. So you need to think about a detailed response to the question, embedded quotation. So a lot of you have probably done lots of information on that in your classes, but trying to include the quotations within your answer rather than introducing each quote, saying, so evidence of this is within this quote. Rather than doing that, actually include it in the answer itself. You need to use techniques, so link them to the methods used by the poet. So methods would be things like figurative language, and then going into more detail talking about what type of figurative language. So you could talk about personification, you could talk about similes, you could talk about metaphors, or you could talk about things like listing, and then you can talk about repetition. And again, a real considered effect on the reader. So it says here, examination of effects of the writer's methods on readers. So really think about how that's going to affect the reader when they are reading through the poem. And then finally, because I know you're all aiming for the top results, for 21 to 24 marks, the top end results, you need a sophisticated response with a variety of quotations used. So you need to think about the way that you're writing your response as well. So it says critical, exploratory, conceptualised response to task and text. And then it says judicious use of precise references. So that's using lots of different quotations to support the points that you're making. Finally, a vast use of terminology, lots of different terminology, not just repeating the same bits, like repetition, using more sort of succinct terminology to really explain what your point is you're trying to make. Okay, nobody's aiming for the lowest grade, I'm aware of that, but just bear in mind that to get 1 to 4 marks, you still need to be answering the question and you still need to reference the text. So it's still really important to get off the start mark, you need to make sure you're referencing the text. And it says possible reference to subject terminology, and that's really early down the mark scheme. If you're not doing that, you can't even hit 1 to 4 marks. So you must make sure that you're constantly thinking, does this paragraph reference any techniques? Does this paragraph have a quote in it? Every paragraph you write, that's what I want you to make sure that you're doing. Okay, this was the poem from last year. You've probably seen it on a mock paper that you've done at some point. And what I've done here is I've just listed some typical techniques that you're going to find in your poems that you're going to receive. So they might not all feature, but there will 100% be some of these techniques in the poems that you're going to get tomorrow. So as soon as you get in there, what you need to be doing, as soon as you're reading through that poem, is have your pen in your hand and just be annotating it. Don't waste any time reading through it and then reading back through it again, looking for techniques. Find them as soon as you're in there. If you're really struggling for the more specific techniques like caesura or juxtaposition or anaphora, if you're really struggling with those, then there's absolutely no harm in looking at the word classes, because I know you've been doing a lot of work on that recently as well, sort of parsing and things in some of your lessons. So if you just want to comment on a single word, you want to do some single word analysis, verbs, nouns, adjectives, adverbs, if you can use them, then make sure you do. It's so much more effective than if you say the word. Okay, you're going to get those marks for AO2 if you manage to do that. Okay, and then finally, the last question, the 8 marker. So this is the one where you get a second poem and you have to compare it to the first one. I'm just going to talk you through the mark scheme, because again, that's all we've really got when it comes to unseen poetry. So to get 3 to 4 marks, I'm not going to talk 1 to 2, to get 3 to 4, some comparison of effects on the writers. So you need to make sure that you're comparing. A lot of the time, students just write about one of the poems, so you need to make sure you do write about both of them. Some relevant use of subject terminology. Again, to get anywhere near the top bit, you need to make sure you're using that terminology. 5 to 6 marks, comparative examination of the effects of the writer's methods on the reader, so you're thinking about the reader. Again, so use of the language, the subject terminology. If you're not doing those things, then you can't get any higher than this bit. And then the very top, exploratory comparison of writers' use of language, structure and form with subject terminology used judiciously. Again, that word judiciously meaning lots of it. Don't just stick to the very simple basic ones. Convincing comparison of effects of writers' methods on the reader. So you really need to be thinking about that comparison, which was where a lot of people fell short last time. And the slides will be up so you can look through that, where that is on the AQA website. So you should be quite familiar with that already. So I'm just going to, you've seen these before, but I just want to make you really aware that when you are, when your work's being marked, the examiners want it to be really easy. They want to be able to apply what you've done to the mark scheme really, really simply. And where comparison was written so frequently on that mark scheme, if you use these, it just makes it so much easier for the examiner to see where you are actually comparing. So I've got just pretty much listed some different connectives that you can start each paragraph with. So if you're showing a difference, so in the opposite, you can use the ones in the blue. If you're showing a similarity, you can show the ones in like a cream colour over there. So I'll give you, I'll leave these up on the slides for you to have a look at later, and you can jot any down that you think you might need in the exam tomorrow. And basically just really, really remember terminology for this exam. You can't really do as well as you probably deserve unless you use that terminology. Section C is really, really important. It's not the bit that needs to be left for the final 15 minutes of the exam. You just need to spend a little bit more time thinking about the 2 poems that you're given. and best of luck. Thank you.
So, for this DNA lecture, I'm going to go over the main themes, the key characters linked to that theme, the key contexts, and also the key quotations. So for a DNA exam, you'll be given one of two questions. And generally speaking, it will be a question on theme and or a question on a character. So the first theme I want to talk about is tension. Throughout the whole play, it could be argued that tension is palpable in every scene. And part of the reason tension is really important is obviously that the teenagers are in a really uncomfortable situation where they don't know what to do with Adam and with the predicament that they've found themselves in. So tension is throughout the play because it matches the teenagers' uncertainty. At every turn, they do not know what they are doing. And this sort of tension is constant to ensure that their sort of heightened suspense is evident throughout the play. And this is seen structurally through the characters of Jan and Mark, who begin every single act with their stick-a-mythia, their sort of table tennis conversations. In the first one is the most obvious example, where they sort of repeat each other's words. Jan says dead, and then Mark repeats dead, and it's this idea that we are left in the same uncertainty that those characters are also in. The tension is also really obvious in sort of Mark when he talks about what happened to Adam, the torture they put him through. They are also tense because Kelly creates them as tense because they do not know what they're doing, and they're trying to sort of get out of a situation where they call Adam a nutter as a way of trying to make themselves feel better about what they did. And tension is finally really obvious in Act 3, Scene 2, when Kathy sort of brings in Brian, and Adam is obviously being discovered at this stage, and we're uncertain when Kathy says he's a mess, because this could be referring to both Adam or Brian. And the idea that Kelly is using here is that even though Adam is one character who has been tortured, humiliated, and really damaged by the play, Brian is a sort of alter ego that shows that this is what might happen to if he was in a different situation. The key characters then to consider for tension are Adam and Brian, as just discussed, because remember they're sort of two sides of one coin. Adam is the one who's tortured, humiliated by the group, but in a way Brian is also victimised, tortured mentally and physically by the group. And Jan and Mark are also really important characters because structurally they're the ones who keep that tension high at the start of every act. Thank you. Because of this tension, they are unsure about what they're doing, and because of it, they're sort of mobbed together. Remember, this idea of safety in numbers is really strong throughout DNA, and that's why our second theme is really important. This idea of mob mentality, gang culture. Again, two really similar ideas. Because they are leaderless, there's no adults in the play, they have no guidance. So instead they turn to certain people as their leaders. And Phil sort of states here, I'm in charge, everyone is happier, what's more important, one person or everyone? And there's this idea is really strong for mob mentality. Because Phil, as a leader, he sort of thinks what's more important is the good of everyone, the greater good. And he thinks he can just sacrifice the lives of someone like Brian, like Adam, because they're one person in a whole group. And it's this idea then that the whole is more important than the single person. And you can overlook the sufferings of one person if the whole group is kept together. And this really drives the mob mentality throughout the story, because it's everyone sort of gunning for everyone sort of thinking for themselves, but in a big group. And in this big group, they're protected, they've got stability, and they are less vulnerable. Leah sort of swears in the play right at the start, partly to show this sort of representation of teenagers, the colloquial language in which teenagers speak, but it's also showing that when they're in this situation, this sort of gang-like situation, where they're sort of collected together and they have no way out, they actually have no way out, but as a group, as a whole gang, they have more of a chance against uncertainty than they would as individuals. The key characters for this then are Danny, Danny is a really important character because he's someone in the play who's got aspirations. He wants to be a dentist right at the start of the play. But because he falls into this gang, because he goes along with the mob, eventually his aspirations, his dreams of being a dentist, fall apart. He ends up being a dentist, sure, but remember the quote we had right at the start, that it feels like he's falling in. Whenever he looks in a patient's mouth, he feels like he's going to fall in. And it's this trauma of the sort of torture that he was participating in by not sort of saying anything against it, which affects his adult life. Lou is the massive example of the victims of gang culture, of mob mentality. She's another one who just sort of goes along with the play, doesn't say anything, she only complains, she keeps saying that we're screwed, offers no way out. And she's another example of a character who sort of goes along with the flow and doesn't contribute anything to the group, but doesn't do anything positive either. And Phil finally is a really important example of mob mentality because he's obviously the leader of the group, and he's the one who sort of drives the group along, even though he himself doesn't really know what he's doing, even though he likes to think so. Two key bits of context then to pay attention to with mob mentality and gang culture is the issue of peer pressure, number one. The play is sort of described as an example of modern peer pressure, of how human beings naturally follow each other. And teenagers then, the idea of teenagers without adult support, without adult intervention, will just flock together and will just sort of react with each other, with their peers, going along whatever path their peers lead them, regardless if that path is a good or bad one. This then leads us to the theme of responsibility and guilt. If you're in a group, the responsibility diffuses. If all of you are shouting out in a lesson, then none of you are responsible for the fact that each and every one of you are shouting out. And this is similar for DNA, because all of them are in some way implicated in the crimes. They feel that none of them are actually responsible for the individual crimes that they have each committed. And Danny, again, is another example of this. He was part of the group, he did not contribute to any of the torture at all, but he also didn't say anything, because he felt that he was protected as part of the group. And the responsibility catches up with him in the form of guilt, right at the end of the play, through the sort of trauma of watching Adam being tortured. He feels like he's going to fall in, is an reference, is an allusion back to Adam falling into the grill. Him looking into his patient as a dentist, into his patient's mouth, and feeling like he's going to fall into that patient's mouth, is an allusion to the trauma of, is a sort of reminder of Adam falling in, and that's that trauma replaying in his head. Again, he joined the Jesus Army. Religion throughout the play has been denigrated, it's been mocked, it's been made to seem like a bad thing. And if we take again, religion is a collective body of people, and obviously strength in number. If you believe in this one cause, then you're safe, you're protected from whatever may have you in the world. And John Tate, having tried to be leader, having to try to take responsibility for the group, was overwhelmed by this pressure. And because of it, he ends up joining the Jesus Army. He retreats into a different group. You could argue he escaped one group, but actually he ends up in another group, an even bigger group, arguably, the Jesus Army, Christianity. And because of it, he does that out of guilt. Not because he suddenly turned Christian, but simply out of guilt, that he did something wrong, he was part of these crimes. And for him to feel better, he had to join this group so that he had this idea of Christian forgiveness, of having your sins washed away, is all what John Tate is trying to do here. Yeah? And the key characters then are John Tate, because of what I've described, Richard, because he is the most, I would argue he's one of the most responsible in the group. He doesn't participate in anything, he's sort of level-headed, and he tries, at the end, he's the one who tries to bring Phil back into the fold. He's the one who tries to keep the group ticking over. And finally Brian, because he's the one who's he's the biggest victim because of the guilt. He's the one who's affected the most by the guilt, and of course it drives him into this mental trauma. He's on more and more pills at the end of the story. He's the one who's been hurt the most. Yeah? And this responsibility and guilt is driven really by their violent acts. They weren't just calling Adam names, they weren't just sort of saying nasty things about him, they were actively hurting him. And this violence really drives the trauma. And this violence is something that pervades and affects every member of the group. Leah, the most moral, the most passive, the nicest character, arguably, in DNA, is drawn into this violence. The ideas of peer pressure, of mob mentality, she imitates the groups around her. Because her friends are doing these horrible, violent things, she is emboldened. She also wants to, sort of thinks it's okay to do these violent things. And remember, she starts off in the first act by threatening to sort of pull her teeth out with a pair of rusty pliers, and in the second act, she actually commits an act of violence. Albeit you could argue it's less an issue because it's to an animal, but either way, she sort of describes in detail how she drives a screwdriver, sort of drives something through Jerry's head to kill it. And again, she's showing someone who's been hurt by and sort of corrupted by the violence. And this violence is sort of, her violence foreshadows the group's ultimate violence at the end. Because don't forget that all of Adam's stuff happens like off scene. We don't see Adam getting things thrown at him. We don't see Adam being burned by cigarettes. We're only told this indirectly. But the sort of biggest, the most horrific act of violence, again told indirectly, is sort of in the play, is Phil placing the bag over Brian's head. We don't see Brian being suffocated in any way, or Adam, sorry, being suffocated in any way in the story, but the violence is shown through the stage direction, and it's the sort of action speaking louder really than the words of Phil willingly causing pain to Brian. And this violence is a screenshot of what sort of what Kelly thinks teenage life is like at the moment. If we look at the key context, there's a time of ASBO's, antisocial behaviour orders, which were where sort of in the early 2000s, where the police could criminalise young people. If you committed a crime out sort of on the streets, a police officer could slap an ASBO on you and it would go on your file as a juvenile crime. There was a time of the London riots with like loads of teenagers sort of robbing shops, causing violence, starting fires, and it's sort of playing this idea then of teenagers being violent as being criminalised. The minority of teenagers are being judged by, the majority are being judged by the minority. All teenagers are seen as violent because, say, 5% of them, even less than that, 1% of them are actually violent. Key characters of violence are Kathy. She is a sadistic character, a character who enjoys other characters being in pain. And she starts off being like, sort of innocent enough, but towards the end of it, obviously, she's the one who chops off the first year's finger. She's the one who's brutalised by the actions. John Tate's a really obvious example of violence. He's the one sort of being aggressive, domineering at the start. And then you could argue Phil is also violent, because even though not through actions, he delegates these sort of violent acts to other people. But does this make DNA a play that is just having a go at teenagers, so that all teenagers are horrible and that they are just a bunch of sheep who follow each other and sort of burn each other with cigarettes? I would argue not. A key theme, final theme in DNA then, is morality. And morality is most obvious through the character of Leah, who I would argue is a sort of shining light, a beacon of hope in the play. She says, sort of poignantly in one of her many soliloquies monologues, that if you can change one thing, you can change the world. Her boyfriend believes that the whole group is more important, that the greater good is the most important thing, that one person doesn't matter more than the whole group. But Leah thinks differently. She thinks that if you can change one thing, one single thing, you can make the world a better place. And this shows that she's a moral character. Whereas Phil thinks that the greater good is more important, Leah thinks that single individual people can make the world a better place. And therefore I'd argue that Leah is a symbol of morality, a sort of hope or optimism in the story, because it's empowering, it's emboldening, thinking that if I can do something right, if I change one habit, I can make the world a better place. And she here is really talking about the butterfly effect, sort of knock on, if one thing changes, another thing changes, and if another thing changes, where does that go? And so her morality is most obvious in her absence. Mark says at the end she's gone, and you could argue symbolically this is like the shining light, the beacon of hope, the beacon of optimism disappearing from the group, and it leaves the group in this sort of moral abyss. The group are left in a bad place where everyone's, Jan and Mark are robbing things, Kathy's cutting off first his fingers, Phil's left in the field on his own, and you could argue that with Leah's departure, the group's morality sort of disappears. And in her absence, it shows how strong her morality was. Because we mustn't forget with Leah, right at the start of the play, we think she's the crazy one. We think she's a psychopathic girlfriend who's trying to chew her boyfriend's ear off. But actually, as the play goes on, it becomes clearer and clearer that she is the only one who's talking any sense. She's the only one who tries to stop them from hurting Brian, from hurting Adam. And it becomes clear that actually, as the play goes on, she is the one talking sense, and it's the rest of them who are going insane. And this links us then to this sort of big quote here, but I just want to give you the whole quote for you to use. Kelly says this: "I think that there are such things in the world as truly good people and truly bad people, that they are tiny percentages at the end of a great big spectrum. The rest of us are just somewhere in the big great area in the middle. So maybe 1% of the world are truly evil, 1% of the world are truly good. But everyone else in between is this sort of grey mass. This, if you think back to mob mentality, we sort of go either side. Either we're a little bit, we sway towards the good side, we sway towards the bad side, but actually everyone's in this impressionable middle, where you could be a good person or you could be a bad person. And the play, ultimately argues that there's two views of like human morality. You're either born bad and the world makes you a better place, society controls you, or that you're born good and the society corrupts you. I strongly believe that DNA argues that actually everyone is born good, but society and your friends around you, your mob mentality, this violence, these images of criminalisation, of young people burning shops down, this is the thing that corrupts young people. And I think then that Kelly's play is ultimately an optimistic, a hopeful play. They're saying that all teenagers can be good. All teenagers can have a good impact on the world, so long as the society around them, their influences can be, the bad influences can be ignored and the good influences can be welcomed. As a very final point then, just final bits of exam-specific advice. DNA is marked on all 4 assessment objectives, yeah? And it's really important that you're doing everything you can to meet them. So number 1, AO1, you're not given an extract, so it's really important that every single reference counts. If you say at the end of the play when Dia disappears and you can't remember a quote, that's fine, that's a reference, that counts. If you say at the start of the play when Mark and John are talking about Adam, that's fine, that's a reference, it counts as AO1. Try and remember nice short quotations. You're more likely to remember the short ones. Like, notice all my quotes are nice and short, because it's easier to remember, it's also easier to get into an essay. Slight mistakes in quotations are not marked down. The attempt is rewarded, and the slight mistake wouldn't be negatively marked. It's important if you answer the theme question, so it's like a mob mentality question, a gang culture question, a peer pressure question, that you use concrete examples to demonstrate your theme. So if it's a theme about leadership, give 3 concrete character examples of leadership. Yeah, and that keeps your essay nice and tight. Don't forget for AO2, it's not just like alliteration, personification, stigmatia. Words, all of you can include these words in your essays. The protagonist, Phil, the playwright, Dennis Kelly, the characterisation of Kathy, the tone in Jan and Mark's speech, the imagery of darkness or falling in. Yeah, if you literally just append these words in front of a character's name, you immediately get more AO2 marks. Demonstration of knowledge of the whole play counts as context, so it's not just the background knowledge I've talked about. Being able to dart across the whole play counts as context. And finally, this is another essay which gives you 4 marks for your spelling and grammar, so please do reread your essay at the end and make sure that you've just dotted your I's and crossed your T's and all these things.